73. Science, Philosophy, the Arts, and Religion. 1124. Faith in the powers of natural science has been characteristic of modern European society for over 3 centuries, but never was there a time when this faith spread to so many people, or was held so firmly and with so few mental reservations as in the half-century preceding the First World War. Science created the foundation for the whole movement of industrialization. And if science gained wide popularity after about 1870, in that person's ignorant of science came to look upon it as an oracle of wisdom, it was because it manifested itself to everybody in the new wonders of daily life. Hardly had the world's more industrialized regions digested the railroad, the steamship, and the telegraph when a whole series of new inventions began to appear during the era of the Second Industrial Revolution. In the 30 years following 1875, the number of patents tripled in the United States, quadrupled in Germany, and multiplied in all modern countries. The scientific and technical advance was as completely international, though confined mainly to the inner zone, as any movement the world has ever seen. Never had the rush of scientific invention been so fundamentally useful, so helpful to the constructive labors and serious problems of mankind. In more basic scientific thinking, important changes set in about 1860 or 1870. Up to that time, generally speaking, the underlying ideas had been those set forth by Isaac Newton in the late 17th century. The law of universal gravitation reigned unquestioned, and with it, hardly less so, the geometry of Euclid, and a physics that was basically mechanics. The ultimate nature of the universe was thought to be regular, orderly, predictable, and harmonious. It was also described as timeless, in that the passage of ages in the natural world brought no significant change or development. By the end of the era considered here, that is, by 1914, the old conceptions and certainties had begun to yield to a surge of new theories and knowledge in every field of scientific research. Changing conceptions in science. The impact of evolution, 1125. In impact upon general thinking, the greatest change came in the new emphasis upon biology and the life sciences. Here, the great symbolic date is 1859, when Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species. Evolution after Darwin, 1809 to 1882, became the most influential intellectual theme of the era. Evolutionary philosophies, holding that the way to understand anything was to understand its development, were not new in 1859. Hegel had introduced the evolutionary conception into modern metaphysics and into historical theories of human society. The idea of progress, taken over from the Age of Enlightenment, was also a kind of 634 Charles Darwin 1 evolutionary philosophy, and the expanding activity in historical studies, under romantic and nationalist auspices, had made people think of human affairs in terms of a process that unfolded over time. In the world of natural science, the rise of geology after 1800 had opened the way to new evolutionary ideas about the surface of the Earth, and venturesome biologists had begun to speculate on an evolutionary development of living forms. What Darwin did was to stamp evolution with the seal of science, marshaling the empirical evidence to support it and offering an explanation of how it worked. In 1871, in The Descent of Man, he applied the same hypotheses to human beings. Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, 1859, set forth scientific arguments for the biological evolution of living organisms and provoked cultural debates far beyond the academic sphere of natural scientists. Darwin is portrayed here as an aging scientific expert whose grandfatherly appearance scarcely suggests the intellectual revolution that he launched through his research and writings. Library of Congress, Prints and Photographs Division, LC UZ 61-104. By evolution, Darwin meant that species are mutable, that no species is created to remain unchanged once and for all, and that all species of living organisms, plant and animal, microscopic or elephantine in dimensions, living or extinct, have developed by successive small changes from other species that went before them. An important corollary was that all life was interrelated and subject to the same laws. Another corollary was that the whole history of living things on Earth, generally held by scientists in Darwin's time to be many millions of years, was a unified history unfolding continuously in a single complex process of evolution. Darwin thought that species changed, not by any intelligent design or by a purposeful activity in the organism, but essentially by a kind of chance. Individual organisms, through the play of heredity, inherited slightly different characteristics, some more useful than others in getting food, fighting or fleeing predators, and producing offspring. And the organisms that had the most useful characteristics tended to survive, so that their characteristics were passed on to their progeny until the whole species gradually changed. Certain phrases, not all of them invented by Darwin, summed up the theory. There was a struggle for existence, resulting in the survival of the fittest through natural selection of the most favored races. Races meaning not human races, but the inherited strains within a species. The 635 struggle for existence referred to the fact that in nature, more individuals were born in each species than could live out a normal lifespan. The fittest were those individual specimens of a species having the most useful characteristics, such as fleetness in deer or ferocity in tigers. Natural selection meant that the fittest survived without a preordained 1127 purpose or the interventions of a creator. The favored races were simply the members of a species who had good survival powers in a complex natural environment. Survival of the fittest. Darwin's ideas precipitated a great outcry. Scientists rushed to defend him, and churchmen attacked him. The biologist T.H. Huxley became the chief spokesman for Darwin, Darwin's bulldog. He debated with, among others, the Bishop of Oxford, Samuel Wilberforce, who denounced Darwin and his supporters for saying that human beings came from monkeys. It was feared that all grounds of human dignity, morality, and religion would collapse. Darwin himself remained complacent on this score. Under civilized conditions, he said, the social and cooperative virtues were useful characteristics assisting in survival, so that we may expect that virtuous habits will grow stronger, becoming perhaps fixed by inheritance. Much of the outburst against Darwin was somewhat trivial, nor were those who attacked him generally noted for spiritual insight, yet they were not mistaken in sensing a profound danger. That Darwinism said nothing of God, providence, creative, or intelligent design, or salvation was not surprising. No science ever did. That evolution did not square with the first chapter of Genesis was disturbing, but not fatal. Much of the Old Testament was already regarded as symbolic, at least outside fundamentalist religious circles. Even the idea that humans and animals were of one piece was not ruinous. The animal side of human nature had not escaped the notice of theologians. The novel and upsetting effects of evolutionary biology emerged most clearly in the changing conceptions of nature and in the implicit challenges to long-held ethical beliefs. Nature was no longer a harmony. It was a scene of struggle. Nature red in tooth and claw. Elimination of the weak was natural, and it might even be considered good insofar as it contributed to evolutionary development. Such conceptions of what was good or beneficial for evolutionary progress profoundly challenged traditional religious ideas about morality and virtue. Indeed, the potential 11128 critique of Christian ethics posed a greater threat to religious values than the revision of the biblical account of creation. Darwin's theory asserted that there were no fixed species or perfected forms, but only an unending flux. Change was everlasting, and everything seemed relative to time, place, and environment. There were no higher norms of good and bad. A good organism was one that survived where others perished. Adaptation replaced virtue. Outside successful adaptation, there was nothing right. The test was, in short, success. The fit were those who survived. And here Darwinism merged with the new realism, or realpolitik, and other social doctrines that were appearing in Europe at the same time from other causes. Changing views of nature 636, such as the British or German empires, were bound to rise, or that war was morally a fine thing, proving the virility and survival skills of those who fought. These ideas gave new meanings to national wars and to the claims for cultural or racial superiority that were used to justify late 19th century European imperialism. In 1129, such at least were the implications if one generalized from science, carrying over scientific findings into human affairs. And the prestige of science was so great that this is precisely what many people wished to do. With the popularization of biological evolution, a school of social theorists known as social Darwinists actively applied the ideas of the struggle for existence and survival of the fittest to human society. Social Darwinists were found all over Europe and the United States. Their doctrines were put to various political, cultural, and racist uses to claim that European peoples or races were naturally superior to people of other races, or that the upper and middle classes deserved their social comforts and advantages because they had proved themselves fitter than the shiftless poor, or that big business in the nature of things had to take over smaller concerns, or that some states, Charles Darwin, On the Origin of Species, London, John Murray, 1860, pp. 489 to 490, Genetics, Anthropology, and Psychology. Meanwhile, Gregor Mendel, 1822 to 1884, an Austrian monk patiently experimenting with the cross-pollination of garden peas in his Augustinian monastery, arrived at an explanation of how heredity operates and how hybridization can take place. Unlike Darwin, his findings, published in 1866, were ignored until 1900, when they were rediscovered and became the basis for the new science of genetics. Mendel's ideas foreshadowed the remarkable breakthroughs in the scientific study of heredity and control over genetic materials that began in the second half of the 20th century and have continued into our own time. Gregor Mendel anthropologists gained public influence in this era by setting out to explain the physical and cultural characteristics of all branches of humankind. Physical anthropologists became interested in the several human races, arguing, for example, that Europeans 637, 111, 31 might be favored in the Darwinian sense, that is, superior in inheritance and survival value. Some European scientists and intellectuals also extended their racist categories to assert that the Nordics or Germans or Anglo-Saxons were superior among Europeans. The public became more race-conscious than Europeans had ever been before. On the other hand, the cultural anthropologists, surveying all manner of primitive or complex societies with scientific comparisons, seemed sometimes to teach a more deflating doctrine. Scientifically, it seemed, no culture or society was better than any other, all being adaptations to an environment, or merely a matter of custom, of the mores, as people said, in careful distinction from morals. The new anthropology thus contributed new cultural evidence to support a kind of relativism or skepticism, a negation of values, a belief that right and wrong were matters of social convention, psychological conditioning, mere opinion, or point of view. We are describing, let it be emphasized, not the history of science itself, but the effects of science upon European cultures and beliefs at the time. The impact of anthropology was felt keenly in religion, too. Sir James Frazer, 1854 to 1941, in his multi-volumed The Golden Bough, demonstrated that some of the most sacred practices, rites, and ideas of Christianity were not unique among human religious traditions. Similar rituals and beliefs could be found in numerous pre-modern societies. And, according to Frazer, only the thinnest of lines divided belief in magic from religion. Anthropology, like Darwinian evolution, could therefore undermine traditional religious beliefs, including a belief in either the uniqueness or the universal truth of European religions. Anthropology and Religion, 1132. Psychology, as a science of human behavior, led to thoroughly upsetting implications about the very nature of human freedom and rationality. It was launched in the 1870s as a natural science by the German physiologist Wilhelm Wundt, 1832 to 1920, who developed various new experimental techniques. The Russian Ivan Pavlov, 1849 to 1936, conducted a famous series of experiments in which he conditioned dogs to salivate automatically at the ringing of a bell once they had become accustomed over a period of time to associate the sound with the serving of their food. Pavlov's observations were important. They implied that a great part of animal behavior, and presumably human behavior, could be explained on the basis of conditioned responses. In the case of human beings, their actions and responses to various situations were apparently conditioned or deeply shaped by earlier environments, training, and social experiences rather than by personal choices or conscious reasoning. Most significant of all the developments in the study of human behavior was the work of Sigmund Freud, 1856 to 1939, and those influenced by him. Freud, a Viennese physician, founded psychoanalysis at the turn of the century. He came to believe that certain forms of emotional disturbance, like hysteria, were traceable to unconscious desires and painful earlier forgotten episodes of patients' lives. After first trying various techniques such as hypnosis, which he soon abandoned, he employed free association, or free recall. If patients could be helped to bring their suppressed desires or painful experiences into conscious recall, the symptoms of illness would often disappear. Sigmund Freud, 638, 11, and 33. From these beginnings, Freud and his followers explored the role that the unconscious played in all human behavior, he himself stressing the sexual drive. In one of his most famous books, The Interpretation of Dreams, 1900, he argued that the analysis of dreams provided the most direct access to a person's repressed memories and unconscious mind. In later books, such as Civilization and Its Discontents, 1930, Freud extended his account of unconscious drives and frustrations into the broader cultural spheres of religion, education, art, literature, and war, arguing that the deepest desires within the human mind were both repressed and expressed in the social customs and institutions of all societies. Freud and Freudian ideas had great influence on the social and behavioral sciences, and a good deal of the Freudian vocabulary later entered into everyday modern language and popular culture. Psychoanalysis gained transnational cultural influence by stressing that wide areas of human behavior came from drives or fears outside conscious control, and by suggesting that human beings were not essentially rational creatures at all. Although Freud identified with the scientific traditions of the Enlightenment, his theory of the unconscious called into question the classical liberal and Enlightenment assumptions about how reasonable free persons developed, explained, and acted upon their individual interests or beliefs. Sigmund Freud's description of the unconscious mind reshaped modern conceptions of human psychology and influenced the arts, literature, and social theories, as well as the medical treatment of mental illnesses. As this photograph suggests, however, the revolutionary Dr. Freud was also a typical member of his own cultural milieu, the professional class in early 20th century Vienna. Mondadori portfolio, Getty Images. The new physics. The revolution in biology of the 19th century, together with the developments in psychology and anthropology, were soon to be matched and surpassed by the revolution in physics. In the late 1890s, physics was on the threshold of a revolutionary transformation. Like Newtonian mechanics in the 17th century and Darwinian evolution in the 19th, the new physics represented one of the great scientific revolutions of all time. There was no single work comparable to Newton's Principia or Darwin's On the Origin of Species, unless Albert Einstein's theory of relativity, propounded in a series of scientific papers in 1905 and 1916, might be considered as such. Instead, there was a series of discoveries and findings, partly mathematical and then increasingly empirical, that transformed scientific views of matter and energy. In Newtonian physics, the atom, the basic unit of all matter, which the Greeks had hypothesized in ancient times, was like a hard, solid, unstructured billiard ball, permanent and unchanging, and matter and energy were separate and distinct. 1134, Einstein's theory of relativity. But a series of discoveries profoundly altered this conception of matter in the early decades of the 20th century. In 1896, the French scientist Antoine-Henri Becquerel, 639, discovered radioactivity, observing that uranium emitted particles or rays of energy. In the years immediately following, from the observations and discoveries of the French scientists Pierre and Marie Curie and the Englishmen J.J. Thomson and Lord Rutherford, there emerged the notion that atoms were not simple, but complex, and moreover, that various radioactive atoms were by nature unstable, releasing energy as they disintegrated. The German physicist Max Planck demonstrated in 1900 that energy was emitted or absorbed in specific and discrete units or bundles, each called a quantum. Moreover, energy was not emitted smoothly and continuously as previously thought, nor was it as distinguishable from matter as once supposed. In 1913, the Danish physicist Niels Bohr postulated an atom consisting of a nucleus of protons surrounded by electrically charged units called electrons. rotating around the nucleus, each in its orbit, like a minuscule solar system. The new theories that emerged in physics after 1900 transformed earlier Newtonian science and gave the young Albert Einstein an international reputation. This picture shows Einstein standing next to his personal books and papers in the 1920s, several years before he moved to the United States to escape the intolerance and repression in Nazi Germany. 1135, General Photographic Agency, Hulton Archive, Getty Images. The study of radioactivity led scientists back toward an idea long rejected, the favored view of the alchemists, that matter was transmutable. In a way undreamed of even by the alchemists, it was convertible into energy. The German-born Jewish scientific genius Albert Einstein, 1879 to 1955, expressed this conversion of matter into energy in a famous formula E equals mc2. The formula summarized his theory of relativity, which also carried the profoundly revolutionary notion that time, space, and motion were not absolute in character, but were relative to the observer and the observer's own movement in space. In later years, in 1929 and in 1954, Einstein brought together into one common set of laws, as Newton formerly had done, a unified field theory, an explanation of gravitation, electromagnetism, and subatomic behavior. Einstein's theories were difficult for most people to understand, and many of his ideas remained controversial, but even non-scientists began to recognize that the new science was modifying much that had been taken for granted since Newton. The Newtonian world was being replaced by a four-dimensional world, a kind of space-time continuum, and in mathematics, non-Euclidean geometries were being developed. E equals mc2 640 111 36. It turned out, too, that neither cause and effect, nor time and space, nor Newton's law of universal gravitation meant very much in the subatomic world, nor indeed in the cosmos when objects moved with the speed of light. It was impossible, as the German scientist Werner Heisenberg demonstrated a little later, in 1927, by his principle of uncertainty, or indeterminacy, to ascertain simultaneously both the position and the velocity of the individual electron. On these foundations established before the First World War, there developed the new science of nuclear physics and the tapping of the atom's energy. The atom and its world of subatomic particles were discovered to be even more complex than anyone had recognized before 1914. Despite the complexity of the scientific language and theories, new ideas about the relativity of human knowledge soon began to influence European art, philosophy, and literature, much as Newtonian physics had influenced non-scientific thought in the Enlightenment-era culture of the 18th century. Trends in philosophy and the arts. Although some writers and artists resembled earlier Romantic thinkers in criticizing Enlightenment ideas or modern science, most European intellectuals in this period viewed science as the model for all forms of knowledge. They were drawn to positivism or to the belief that scientific methods provided the only positive knowledge of the world. Anything unknowable to science must therefore remain uncertain or unknowable forever, a doctrine called agnosticism, or the acknowledgement of the limits to what can be known about certain physical or metaphysical questions. The English sociologist Herbert Spencer, 1820 to 1903, was one widely read popularizer of agnosticism who pictured a universe governed by the open-ended natural selection of Darwinian evolution. As Spencer described it, all philosophy could be unified, organized, and coordinated through the doctrine of evolution. This doctrine he applied not only to all living things, but also to sociology, government, and economics as well. The evolution of society, he believed, was leading toward increasing freedom for the individual, the role of governments being merely to maintain freedom and justice. Governments should therefore not interfere with natural social and economic processes, nor coddle the weak and unfit. Yet, like Darwin himself, Spencer believed that altruism, charity, and goodwill were useful as individual ethical virtues. He separated such virtues from religious traditions, however, by describing them as laudable products of evolutionary development. Agnosticism, 1137. These latter views of individual ethics were not shared by another of the serious writers of the age, also much influenced by evolutionary ideas, the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, 1844 to 1900. Drawing upon many intellectual currents of the century, Nietzsche was an unsystematic, radical thinker whose complex ideas often defied conventional cultural categories. It is evident, however, that he held a low opinion of modern democratic societies. From a background of evolutionary thinking, he developed the concept of an overman, a new kind of noble being who would create new ethical values and philosophical truths that would enable him to break away from constraining cultural traditions and also to dominate or dazzle the multitude. Qualities of humility, patience, helpfulness, hope, and love, in short, the specifically Christian virtues Nietzsche described as a slave morality concocted by the weak to disarm the strong. He drew sharp contrasts between the ethical traditions of Christianity and his own philosophical values, which emphasized aristocratic qualities of courage, love of danger, intellectual excellence, and personal independence. Indeed, he argued that all humans, even philosophers, were driven more by their instincts and a will to power than by reason or rational thought. Friedrich Nietzsche, 641, 11138. Nietzsche therefore condemned the philosophical legacies of Plato and Kant, as well as the main ideas of 19th century liberalism and socialism. His critique of religion revived and revised some themes of classical paganism. Although Nietzsche was neither much read nor respected during his own lifetime, his writings soon attracted both German and international interest from readers who admired his frank, unyielding engagement with the unsettling ethical or philosophical implications of the new evolutionary ideas. More generally, his critical analysis of reason, rationality, and the belief in universal truths became widely influential among anti-Enlightenment thinkers before and after the First World War. Aie Orana Maria by Paul Gauguin, French 1848 to 1903. Gauguin moved to Tahiti in the early 1890s, searching for non-European alternatives to the culture and art he had known in France. His portrayals of Tahitians often conveyed European ideas about the exoticism of colonized non-European people, but his use of color and symbolic images influenced later avant-garde artists in Europe. Gauguin also continued to draw on classical European artistic themes. The title of this painting means Hail Mary, an allusion to the biblical Annunciation, in which the angel Gabriel told the Virgin Mary that she would give birth to a child. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York, bequest of Sam A. Lewison, 1951. 1139. As in the sciences and philosophy, the new works of creative imagination, literature, drama, and the fine arts conveyed changing conceptions of truth, ethics, and social life. Some writers, like Émile Zola in France or Henrik Ibsen in Scandinavia, turned to the portrayal of social problems, producing a realistic literature that dealt with industrial strife, strikes, prostitution, divorce, or insanity. New psychological theories also appeared in literary works, especially in fictional portraits of troubled characters and irrational human behavior. The new novels and plays were indeed often truer to specific social or psychological experiences than the older forms of European literature. But some literary movements, for example, the symbolist poets in France, were experimenting with language in works that moved modern writing far away from the literal representation of social realities. In a sense, the arts followed the intellectual developments of the age, reflecting, as they do today, diverse attitudes of relativism, irrationalism, social determinism, linguistic ambiguity, and interest in the operations of the unconscious mind. On the other hand, never had artist and society been so far apart. The French painter Paul Gauguin, an extreme case, fled to the South Seas, abandoned his family and modern European life, and reveled in vivid tropical colors. See Gauguin's painting Ia Orana Maria on this page. Others became absorbed in technicalities or mere capricious self-expression. Art at its extreme 642 fringe became almost incomprehensible, and the average person seemed deprived of a visual means, as old as the cave paintings of the Stone Age, of perceiving and enjoying the world. 1140 Rouen Cathedral, West Façade by Claude Monet, French 1840 to 1926. A distinctive fascination with light can be seen in most Impressionist works, as in Claude Monet's paintings of the cathedral at Rouen. This view of the cathedral in the winter sunlight was one of a series that Monet painted in the 1890s, when he portrayed the different appearances and colors of the same objects in various shades of light at various times of the day. National Gallery of Art of 1141. The artistic movement known as Impressionism did not sever all links between painting and the external world. However, the Impressionists became perhaps the most influential artists in late 19th century Europe. Rising to prominence in the 1870s and 1880s, painters such as Claude Monet, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Camille Pissarro, Berthe Morisot, and Mary Cassatt rejected traditional styles of academic painting in France and turned instead to the representation of everyday life and the colorful play of light in the natural world. In contrast to earlier painters who had worked in studios and depicted scenes from mythology, classical history, or exotic cultures, the Impressionists preferred to paint outdoors and to portray the streets or buildings of modern France, the daily activities of ordinary people, or the pleasures of a modern cafe. Monet was especially adept at representing the same object in various shades of light. See, for example, the Rouen Cathedral on this page. But all Impressionists used light and color rather than classical lines or themes to convey their impressions of the modern world. Most Impressionist painters were French, and most were men, though women such as Morisot and the American-born Cassatt also produced innovative works, often portraying women 643 in the different phases of their lives. See Morisot's The Harbor at Lorient on this page, and Cassatt's The Boating Party on p. 645. Impressionism gradually gained international influence and became the aesthetic starting point for other artists, usually called post-impressionists, who portrayed people and objects in novel and increasingly abstract forms and surprising colors. The works of Paul Cézanne are influential examples of the post-impressionist art that pushed 142, The Harbor at Lorient by Berthe Morisot, French, 1841 to 1895. The French painter Berthe Morisot was one of the first women to adopt the methods and perspectives of Impressionist art. This painting shows the movement's characteristic concern with the play of light and color in outdoor scenes. The portrayal of a young woman on a waterside wall was also typical of Morisot's particular interest in representing the experiences and memories of women. National Gallery of Art. Steadily beyond Impressionism, in a continuing attempt to represent the artist's distinctive personal vision of human experience, see Cézanne's self-portrait with Beret on p. 646. By the early 20th century, artists such as Pablo Picasso, Georges Braque, and Vasily Kandinsky were painting cubist or abstract expressionist, works that represented natural objects and the human body in highly abstract forms and splashes of color, most of which bore little or no resemblance to what scientists might have called objective reality. See Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon on p. 647. After the First World War, and continuing throughout the 20th century, the same trends of subjectivism in the arts attracted a wider, less skeptical audience. People read books without punctuation or with peculiar punctuation, listen to music called atonal, composed for effects of discord and dissonance, and studied intently abstract or non-objective paintings and sculpture to which the artists themselves often refused to give titles. Although they frequently criticized modern industrial society, artists and their art also exemplified the specialization and division of labor in modern social and economic systems. Many artists were no longer creating art for common use or enjoyment, as, for example, in a Renaissance Italian city piazza. They were creative specialists, plying their trade and pursuing their own concerns, like other modern specialists whose work was often incomprehensible to outsiders.